Part 6. Last Stand. New Purgatory. Janet sat at her desk with her head in her hands. Alex had gotten a hold of her and let her know what happened in China. She felt like she was going to be sick, and though she hadn't known most of Alex's new team, she did know Talia. Any war that came to New Purgatory would become much harder to fight without the sword-wielding warrior of faith. "If only I had been there. You might be dead too," she said aloud to herself. Janet didn't know why they were falling apart. Why now? She could only imagine what state of mind both Alex and Layla were in. They were all dying and losing sanity at the expense of battles they were forced to fight, and all she could do was sit there and listen to the stories. Talia. It hurt. It hurt as bad as losing her uncles, Jack, Otto, and Dylan. Friends were becoming a rare commodity. Janet rose from her desk and made way for the bar. The patrons moved out of her path as she walked through the crowded dance floor. Tonight, the bass wasn't entertaining, the lights were antagonistic, and the patrons weren't exotic. It was all annoying. The music grated Janet's ears. She wanted a drink, a fight, or a fuck, anything to get her mind off another fallen friend. But the worst part was knowing that Talia's death was but a small echo in a grander orchestra, trying to save a city Janet had hated in the first place. The bartender didn't even ask her what she wanted. He just brought Janet a glass and a bottle of whiskey. It was almost as if he could feel her mood. As she looked around, she wondered if the entire club could. They were staring at her, but Janet didn't give a fuck. She went to pour herself a glass, but stopped before even tipping the whiskey bottle. Instead, she pushed the glass aside, pulled off the pour, and took a pull from the bottle itself. Then another, and then another. By the time Janet set the bottle down, half the whiskey was gone and she was feeling slightly better. That's when she looked up at the bartender. She hadn't recognized him. Not that she spent much time in the bar these days. She usually had drinks brought up to her office. He was around Alex's height, but he was bulky, like a man that hauled gravel all day. His head was clean-shaven and his face was covered in scars. "You don't look much like a bartender," Janet said evenly. "According to the patrons, I'm not much of one either," the man replied. Janet couldn't place his accent. Whatever it was rare. "Where are you from?" "Not here," the bartender replied. Janet wondered if he was being short with her on purpose. Maybe the man didn't like to talk. Maybe he was hiding something. "Maybe you're just drunk. It's been a while. What did you even eat today?" "Did you eat? Shit." "Are you all right? I've never seen anyone take down that much whiskey in one go," the bartender asked. "No, I'm not, but the booze helps," Janet replied as she stood up from the stool. "I'm going for a walk." She knew the bartender's eyes were locked on her as she walked out, as were the other patrons in the bar. She was something of a figurehead. Janet was used to it. Whether they looked down on her tonight for drinking when she could be working, she didn't know, nor did she care. She had just lost a friend. Alex was sitting behind Layla in the cockpit. He was on the ground trying to keep himself entertained by flipping through his journal. He still hadn't written anything down in it since China. Layla hadn't bothered to ask him if he was okay. She knew the answer. Neither of them were okay, nor would they be for a while. "This will never get any easier, will it?" she asked aloud while she spun her chair around. "I'm not sure it's supposed to. When that happens, we're no better than Morrison, or Beruger, or hell, even Jack. We'll get past it. We just brought freedom to another country. Beruger won't be able to attack us now. Not without worrying about the Council's wrath," Layla stated. "That's one thing to look forward to, and without China he loses another vote. The other nations will come around, and when Japan gets voted in, we'll have the advantage," Alex replied. "It's hard to think of this as a victory, Alex, but it was. We have a tomorrow we don't have to fight for now. We can walk away from war," Layla said. Alex gave her a nod. He knew she was right. The only fights that would break out now would be in dead zones, and maybe one day they'd go to them and help the inhabitants find a new home. But then again, that might have been a fight for someone else. Finally, he thought he might be able to lay down his guns before he lost more friends, or worse. "You're right. China was the end of all we fought for. We're going to find a way to help Janet with the rebuild and get Michaela's memories back. That means no more war and no more bloodshed. I promise," Alex said. Layla spun back around in her seat. Those words were the contrast she needed to the pain of the last 24 hours. She felt a hand run across the back of her neck and a kiss on her cheek. Yes, she would be fine if life went on without war. She would be happy to no longer have to fear if the next firefight would be either her or Alex's last. Peace would come to New Purgatory, and maybe even the world, one day. Tyrese had gone back to drawing in his art book. He took a blank page and drew a single red circle in the center, then filled it in as he went along. From the center globule, he made it drip red like blood coming off it. It was as accurate of a representation of the new Japanese flag as he could get. He had been inspired by the smoke and the sun back in China. His mind was still processing all the destruction he had been a part of, the loss of life he had been privy to in the last few weeks. Losing Gates, Gajil, and Talia was sad certainly, but the amount of Chinese that had been murdered was an atrocity larger than any in recent history, save for the Great War itself. Tyrese had helped commit genocide, and he was unsure if he could live with that fact. As a man who strove to help people, to help refugees, he wondered if he could ever truly cleanse this new blood he found on his hands. "Mikhail, how did we get through this? How many people did we kill?" Tyrese asked as he looked up from his art book. Mikhail knew damn well how to handle it. He had killed the world. He had just helped to do it again with a different type of nuclear weapon. He just let the database take hold. To him, the Chinese were a number that had now been reduced to 0 in Beijing, or the crater that was now Beijing. While others might have found that repulsive, Mikhail knew no other way. It made him curious as to what the real Mikhail would think or believe. "You must press on, Tyrese Vale. There is little we can do about it now. One can only hope that we have done more good than bad in ridding the world of the Chinese government." Tyrese shook his head. "Is that how you justify all the murders? Every life you've ever taken?" Mikhail could not tell if Vale was lobbing an insult at him or asking a genuine question. He could not be sure, and he did not care. "We are all murderers now. How we continue will define us, not how we live in the past. Though if it makes it easier for you, know that they would have killed you just as easily as we killed them, though I doubt they would have any remorse. Perhaps that is what makes you different." Mikhail turned away from Vale and made back for the cockpit. The autopiloting system could land itself if it truly had to, but he did not wish to speak to Tyrese any longer. Alex's bird touched down first, with Mikhail's a few minutes behind. Janet was waiting on the Alonsfo's landing pad with a contingent of soldiers from both New Purgatory and Old Cairo. Alex was impressed. In several short weeks, Janet had taken members of Morrison's Marines and a group of pit fighters and turned them into a real army. "Is this the honor guard?" Alex asked as he gave Janet a hug. "No, the rookies. Only the best for you," Janet replied as she let Alex go and hugged Layla. "Now what in the hell happened out there?" Alex shook his head. Vixer carried a body bag over her shoulder with help from Tyrese. Shaylee was hauling her bag down from the ramp, but he noticed Mikhail was nowhere to be found. He'll come around. He was close to Talia. His mind must be a confusing place right now. The database and what little emotion bubbling through, eating at each other. "Let's go get a drink, and we'll worry about finding a place for Gates. Come on, everyone," Alex stated. Janet had her soldiers take Gates's body away, and the group made for one of the larger booths in the bar. It was a circular space with room for everyone. Layla sat close to Alex. She looked like all she wanted to do was sleep. Her head was rested on his shoulder, and she was wrapped around his arm. "Drinks?" Janet said as she punched up the console that was embedded in the table. "Scotch," Alex said. "Scotch," Layla repeated. "Make it 3, Vixer added. 4, Tyrese continued. "Do I have to say it?" Shaylee said. Janet shook her head and punched up an order for 6 doubles of scotch. She looked up and saw Alex focusing on the marble pattern on the tabletop. Janet looked at everyone else. They all wore the same somber expression, one she knew all too well. She waited until one of the servers came over and placed their drinks in front of them. Janet wanted Alex to take the lead, but he was drained. Instead, she lifted her glass in the air. Everyone else perked up, looking at each other. "To fallen friends and a new hope. To you Sentinels, protecting our people and forging our future." 6 sets of glasses clinked together, and everyone hammered down their drinks. Janet punched up an order for another round. Their night was only beginning. After a few more rounds, Tyrese decided to get up and join the refugees on the dance floor. Vixer stayed behind. She hadn't smiled once. Not that she had before, but it was going to be harder to crack her shell now. Japan and Egypt are on board now. With those two on the council and the support from the Russians, we have enough votes to keep us safe from Germany, Alex explained. What about revenge for what happened to China? Janet asked. They can't pin that on us, Vixer replied. Anyone who saw us there is dead. It looks like an unfortunate accident and makes Baruger look bad for giving away tech too early to a rebuilding nation. Any news from Australia or Jerusalem? Alex asked. No demands, which means we're probably being watched. They have no idea what to do with us yet, Janet said. They'll go through an ambassador, which means you need to pick one out, Vixer said pointedly towards Alex. Alex cracked a half smile. He's out there on the dance floor. Really? Janet asked. Alex, I might need him here. He has a way with the Morrison refugees. You'll have us here. Besides, he's not a soldier, Janet. He's got too much talent to be on the front lines with people like us. Vale has a way with people. I'd have Layla do it, but with her accent it might make the council question our motives. But if you don't want him to go... No, Janet stopped him. You're right. He's the best choice. Alex nodded at her. Good. He knows our history. He'll listen and take orders from you, and he isn't hungry for power. Layla picked up her head a bit and looked through the sea of people. Tyrese was right in the middle. He was sweaty and moving. Alcohol was likely pouring out of his skin, but the man didn't seem to care. Men and women both watched him and gathered around him, joining in his dance. He'll be a little messed up in the short term, Layla said. Janet turned her head and looked back at Tyrese. Janet saw nothing physically wrong with him, but she knew it wasn't about physical destruction. She turned back around towards the group. She let out a sigh and reached for her glass. Who of us isn't? Janet slammed the glass of scotch down her throat. Especially now. Alex lit up a cigarette and tossed the used match on the table. It's not like any of us are good at this. I'll just learn to fly without wings. But it's over now. With your army and leadership. It'll be all right, Layla finished for him. Did you get those tags fixed up? Alex asked. Janet reached into her flight jacket and pushed several metal tags attached to chains across the table. Alex picked one up. Some had words on one side, and on the other had an emblem of a cracked and battered shield with a solid red circle at the center of the design. For the battle in China, and the shield for New Purgatory. Alex turned the tags over. There were small inscriptions like on his old dog tags. Wrath, Chronicle, Fixer, Grit, Honor, Alex said aloud. Then he looked at his own, and one that was for Janet and Layla. They were blank. We'll give Gajil's and Talia's to Tyrese for that memorial he's making, Layla said, grabbing 3 of the tags and passing them over to Vixer and Ferris. Shaylee stared at hers for a few moments before dangling it around her neck. Keeley read the first one to herself. Wrath. She clipped it to her old set of Morrison dog tags, and then she looked at the other one that would have belonged to Gates. Grit. Yeah, that was Gates, she said as she clipped that one onto her chain as well. I wish I'd gotten to know them all better. Gajil died taking a group of soldiers with him. He saved Keeley and I. He never showed any fear. Just pulled the pin on his grenade while he was riddled with bullet wounds. Alex explained. Where did you pick up those other names? Janet asked. I know you have a way with the English language and all. Alex shrugged. Shaylee's a good doc or medic or whatever the hell she is. A medic is fine, Shaylee said. She's a fixer. Tyrese keeps track of our memories. Chronicle. Vixer cocked her head to the side and looked at Alex dead on. And mine? I thought it was self-explanatory. That and you could give Janet a run for her money, even with a rifle. Janet raised an eyebrow. You willing to put money on that, Velasco? She said with sarcasm. Alex shook his head. I'll have to pass on that one. Hey, you think you can get these blank ones done up for us? I could. No reason to. We already have call signs, Janet replied. The reminder can't hurt. We'll worry about it in a few days. The 5 lifted their glasses together and smiled. To the end, Alex said, and the 5 drank. Mikhail found himself sitting on a ledge of a building that overlooked the wreckage of the Empire State Building. What had come to be known as Morrison's Tower. The end was near. He could feel it. The shadow was still sorting through the hatred he had felt for Talia. He didn't understand it. Any of it. The walking through of his past life was worse. Did he hate her for making him relive that? Why would they want to kill her? Mikhail watched the workers below clear away rubble like ants pulling food from a campsite. An end. An end. His new objective was clear. For whatever reason, his countless hours of poring over the database suddenly seemed to make sense. As he looked at the ashes of the tower, he saw the destruction he and his friends had created. Now he needed to focus himself. What do I have to do? What will cause this nightmare to end? Mikhail thought for a prolonged period. Then, almost out of reflex, he reached for his survival knife as he had done 1,000 times. The words came to his lips. The reactor. The shadow stood and made his way away from the tower and towards an objective that would change his life or give him back his old one. Tyrese was passed out on top of the oak table in the apartment rooms the team had called home. Shaylee, who had left the booth early, was boiling needles and prepping medical supplies. Vixer's door was half open. Shaylee could hear her pulling apart weapons and reassembling them. Janet had opted to get more logistics paperwork done instead of catching up on sleep, and Alex and Layla were in their room. Layla was reading through one of Elias's books. Alex still couldn't bring himself to write in his journal. What are you reading? He asked as he sipped from a bottle of scotch and polished the blade he had taken from Shea Vito nearly 7 or 6 months ago. The last thing Eli read. It's called On the Road. About anything interesting? It reads like a journal, Layla replied. Like mine? Not really. There's adventure, but I'd say it's a bit more peaceful. Alex smirked. Sounds boring. Layla shook her head. You wouldn't know boredom if it hit you upside the head. You should read it. Might be a good change from firing a rifle. Yeah, that won't happen. The two sat there for a while. Alex had already hooked his new dog tag to his chain, just like Layla. Then, a siren began blaring. Alex and Layla met Janet down at the bar, which had been cleared out. Vixer, Shaylee, and Tyrese met up with them, but not Mikhail. What the hell is that about? Alex asked as he loaded his rifle. Emergency alarm, air raid. Play a different one when it's a natural disaster, Janet explained as she tied her hair back. We need to get out there, Vixer said. The soldiers are getting anxious. Alex led the team outside. There were at least 10 hell choppers hovering far in the distance, but one in front and center of the club. Here we go again, Alex thought as the bird touched the ground. Mechanical legs stepped down from the rear exit, and a face Alex had seen before. It was a woman, and she came down the hell chopper's ramp alone. Alexander Velasco, I'm Captain Renata Carver. I remember you. Why the hell are you here, and what the fuck are your birds doing in my airspace? Alex asked. I could tell you, but I won't. Thomas Beruga would prefer to talk for me. Carver rolled the same grenade-shaped holographic emitters between herself and the Sentinels. Beruger's image came up. Alex saw he had a smug look on his face. Alex knew that look. It meant retaliation. Alexander, it is a pleasure to see you again, child. I hope you don't mind my hell choppers. After our last discussion, I decided any chat I had with you would require insurance. You brought more of your super soldiers for us to kill? Vixer asked. Quite the contrary. Allow me to explain. Right now, 5 of my birds are encroaching on civilian centers in your city. The soldiers within that bird will slaughter every man, woman, and child they see until they either run out of bullets or blood to spill. Meanwhile, I have 5 more hell choppers heading for your reactor. In fact, they may already be there, Beruger explained. You see, Alexander, I found myself inspired by your team's work in Beijing. So much so that I felt the need to attempt the same feat, if only to prove that I can wage war just as well as you. But you, child, must make a simple choice. Save your civilians from certain death, or save your city from annihilation. On the surface it seems simple, I'm sure, but just imagine all the trust you would lose, even if you did manage to save the reactor. You son of a bitch, Alex said, lifting his rifle and blasting Carver several times in the face. For a moment, Beruger looked surprised, and then Janet fired a shot at the emitter, blowing it and Beruger's image away. What the fuck? Vixer said, drawing out each word. He knows it'll split us up. Some save the civilians and the rest stop the forces at the reactor. Either way, we move too slow to save them all and give his soldiers more time, Alex explained. Divide and conquer, Janet added. We have to save the civilians, Ferris said. If we don't stop them at the reactor, those civilians are dead anyway, Vixer spat. We need to make a choice here, Alex. What the hell do we do? Tyrese asked. Alex turned away from them. So much for leaving war and death behind. Fuck. We need to save the damn reactor. A small team can do it, but they'll have to be able to work closely. The augmented soldiers can wipe out groups of people. The rest of us have got to take out Baruger's soldiers throughout the city. Layla, take Janet and Vale and go to the reactor. I'll take Ferris, Vixer, and the army. We'll clear the city. We finish this shit today. We'll take the bird, Layla said. Let's move. Alex, Ferris, and Vixer marched down 7th Avenue towards what was left of Central Park, which Morrison had turned into an airstrip. Get off the street, Alex yelled. Call the soldiers. He saw birds landing in the distance. Alex broke out in a sprint. Soldiers were now behind him and his small team. He knew Baruger must have sent his augmented soldiers. That was the only reason for so few hellchoppers. Alex knew with those heartless automatons it would make the streets bloody, fast. He dropped behind an overturned bus and began laying shots in the group moving towards the street. I hope those people have comms, Alex said. Listen up. This is Alexander Velasco. I've fought these sons of bitches before. Find a place to flank and keep behind cover. These aren't like any targets you've hit before. Only grenades and heavy fire are going to bring them down. Alex looked behind him, and his troops nodded. Some moved into back alleys looking for ways to flank. He turned back forward and saw the line of Baruger's men ahead. There had to be at least 20 or 25, but they might as well have been their own army. Vixer was across from Alex, laying down fire into the soldiers. They didn't stop coming. Ferris did her best to offer covering fire to New Purgatory's army that moved forward, but Baruger's army pressed on. Now the augmented soldiers were raising their own weapons, and made their bullets crash into the cover Alex and company were using. Their weapons fire was crashing into the army, too, taking out anyone foolish enough to rush them. Alex sat behind the bus for a few moments. Every time an assault ended, another began. Their reloads were timed perfectly. He looked down at his waist. 3 stingers. Alex grabbed one and lobbed it over the bus. Through the cracks in the cover, he could see it had rolled right in front of the augmented soldiers. It exploded, sending shrapnel in every direction, and cutting into the legs of several of the soldiers. One fell to the ground and continued crawling forward, but their firing rate had become disjointed. Now, firing teams, Alex yelled. Vixer saw what Alex was yelling about. 2 squads of 5 came pouring out of an alley adjacent to the augmented. They threw more stingers and fired more rounds. When the augmented began to turn to face those who had flanked them, Alex rushed out. Vixer followed him. The 2 stood out in the open, blasting any soldier not wearing New Purgatory's gray fatigues. Even Ferris got in on the action. She fired her pistol from around cover, and dead-eyed one augmented soldier in the skull. Alex could see flanking teams were taking losses, and so he retracted behind cover. Fall back! Let them retreat into the alleys. We'll hunt them down ourselves. Layla fired up the new bird. The old one had gone missing, and she could only assume it had been Mikhail. He must have heard. He's probably already there. You ready for this? Layla asked as she brought the bird up. Vale and Trishella nodded at her. In the distance, she could see hellchoppers moving towards Brooklyn. That was the hiding place of New Purgatory's Cloudbreaker reactor. The silver hellchopper shot ahead, easily outpacing Baruger's birds. She opened the machine gun turrets up on the closest bird, smashing its hull and sending it gliding to the ground. Holy shit, Janet whooped. That's one. Layla moved in closer and found another bird. She fired, but it juked the shot. The pilot must have learned from its fallen cohort. She had a way around that. He's buying time for the other 3 birds, Vale said. Let's see him bob around this, Layla replied. She flipped the switch that extended a red button on the bird's flight stick. Layla waited 2 seconds and then fired. The ksh sound of a missile fired off below them and made way for the target. There was no dodging it. The enemy hellchopper exploded and illuminated the sky, shortly before becoming refuse and smoke that crashed down to the earth. Layla wanted to smile, but shook her head. Enough killing power like that, we wouldn't need soldiers, she said under her breath. What? Janet yelled from the rear bay. I said we're coming up on the reactor, Layla shouted back. The other 3 birds have already landed. Shit, Janet said. No grenades inside the reactor. We do that and we're doing their job for them. Tyrese looked worried. Sweat was coming down his forehead. What are we supposed to do? There could be at least 10 of them in there. Layla wondered that too, until she saw Mikhail's bird mixed in with the 3 of Baruger's. I'm not sure, but at least we have a shadow. Mikhail watched Baruger's men rush inside the base. He shifted his vision a few times, first to heat sensing. Something was strange. His eyes turned as he changed them again to X-ray. They are not augmented. He could see no implants or forced prosthesis on any of them. Baruger had sent regular soldiers to secure the facility. Mikhail had already evacuated the scientists. Now it would be a simple matter of picking off each soldier one by one. But as he went for his blade, he found he couldn't pull it from its sheath. Wait for backup. Yes, that was the better move. If the soldiers caught wind of being murdered one by one, they could blow the reactor before he could get to them all. At least in a firefight, they would be distracted. The shadow shifted his vision again, back to heat sensing. He saw 3 signatures moving down the stairs toward the main generator room. Mikhail found the will to move again. He opened the storage locker he used as cover and made way for the main computer. 2 of Baruger's men were ahead. One was standing guard, while the second was typing at the keyboard. Mikhail moved with haste and reached for his silenced pistol. He put a round in the first soldier's neck. The man screamed out, causing the soldier at the keyboard to turn, but the shadow was on him. Mikhail pulled his knife and drove it into the man's abdomen, then ripped it out and stabbed it into the area around his collarbone. Mikhail twisted the blade until the soldier's eyes went blank, and he finally fell to the ground. The sound of bullets crashing against walls and railings filled his ears. The firefight had started. The shadow shifted his vision and looked down at the console. The soldier hadn't even cracked the security codes yet. It was a good sign, but it made him feel as if they were only a diversion. Mikhail moved to flank Baruger's men, who were running across the circular railing around the reactor. He did not have the slightest idea what they were trying to accomplish, but watched as Janet dead-eyed 2 running for the cover of a hallway. There were only 6 left now. They had made it to the hallway and were bunkering up. Layla, Janet, and Tyrese fell behind some moving equipment for cover, but the soldiers had not yet seen Mikhail. He moved in. Now was his opportunity. Vixer took point down the long alley. Baruger's soldiers were moving at a steady pace, but not fast enough to escape her onslaught of bullets. Several rounds connected to the back of one, but he kept going as if they were paintballs. Ferris moved ahead of Vixer and aimed her pistol up in the air. She fired off 2 rounds in quick succession, knocking the top of a metal fire escape loose. It sailed down and crashed into one of the augmented. The 2 others that ran didn't even look back at their fallen ally. "Keep after them," Shaylee yelled as she stopped at the struggling soldier. Alex and Vixer kept down the alleyway. Shaylee kneeled. The augmented man struggled to move. The rusted metal fire escape had become his cage. It pinned his legs and back to the ground. Ferris was amazed by the soldier's ability to ignore pain. She couldn't understand it. His eyes were not human, yet familiar, and parts of the skin were replaced by black metal plating. Shaylee reached into her pack for a scalpel and cut a line through the skin that ran parallel to the plating. She pulled the skin back, but no blood came rushing out, just more black plating. What was strange was watching the freshly cut skin slowly heal itself, as if it had never been cut. The realization made her reach for her gun, but it was too late. The soldier forced himself closer to Ferris, dragging the metal cage as he crawled. Ferris fell backwards on her ass and tried crawling herself. The soldier came closer, ripping a piece of sharp metal off the fire escape, and went to thrust it at her. His eyes were twisting in a horrific manner. Ferris fired off the rest of her rounds in wild succession. Most of them slammed into the head and throat. The augmented soldier's arms went limp, crashing to the ground. Shaylee had killed him, or it. The perfect soldier, but flawed in its creation. She reached out and grabbed the metal rod, then drove it into the back of the being's neck, just to be safe. He holds so much control over them. Could Baruger exert this over anyone? And what about those eyes? Shit, she said aloud, forcing herself up and running for Alex and Vixer. Mikhail clicked his comm, so Layla, Vale, and Janet knew he was in the area. They had the soldiers pinned down in the hall. They had only 2 options: retreat for the city or run headlong into bullets. Instead, they decided to stay pinned down while blind firing shots around cover. The shadow crept along the sidewall, nearing the targets. He knew they would be easily flanked. Mikhail reached for his pistol at his chest. and put a round into the nearest soldier who leaned outside of his cover. It surprised the other 5, but Mikhail was on top of them. He rushed the hull. With one arm, he extended his blade and drove it into the chest of a soldier, and fired a shot into the head of the one across with his other. The last 3 ran off down the hall in fear, just as the Shadow had wanted. Mikhail took a few steps back and motioned for the team to join him at the hall's entrance. Layla looked around at the bodies. Mikhail had been efficient and fast. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "No time. We need to chase them. They have brought explosives," Mikhail replied. "All right, I'll come with you," Janet said. "No, you and Vale should guard the computer system. There are more here than you can see." Janet gave Layla and Mikhail a nod and ran for cover by the computer system with Tyrese. "Take point," Mikhail ordered as he drew his pistol. Layla moved ahead of him, her SMG raised. The two followed the narrow hallways for a brief time before they came upon the last 3 soldiers. They were wounded and weary. Layla fired a burst at each of the 3, exposed and out of cover. As they hit the ground, she sauntered over, putting a few more rounds into them, making sure they were dead. Mikhail watched her slender body with hatred. His blood boiled, just as it had when he saw Talia, and again when Baruger's men had met him for the first time. Her offense was existence, and that he could not allow. It would purify him, fix all the wrong he had done in the world. It would bring his old life and everyone he cared about back. Finally, he could escape the title of murderer. "Do as I command." The Shadow placed his gun back in its holster and reached for his blade, slowly moving behind the woman he could once call a friend. He went to drive the knife into her back, but Layla spun around, aiming her SMG up at him. Mikhail knocked it hard from her hand and drove the blade forward into her stomach. When he looked into her eyes, he saw the life draining in a mix of surprise and betrayal. He realized what he had done. "No, you are not finished." Mikhail let Layla and the blade fall to the ground. She looked up at him, mouthing the words, "Why?" He did not answer. Instead, the Shadow ran for the upper levels, to escape to his hellchopper and away from New Purgatory. Layla clicked her comm several times, and did not stop until she could hear Vale and Janet's footsteps approaching from a distance. "Alex, you need to stop," Shaylee yelled. Alex stopped and growled as he did so. "2 augmented heading back towards the airstrip. Cut them off before they get to their birds," he yelled over his comm. He hated delegating. He wanted to make sure they were dead, even if he had to do it himself. "You want to tell me what's so goddamn important?" Alex said as he got in Shaylee's face. She ignored his hostility. "It's Mikhail. The weird symptoms he's been showing. It has nothing to do with his program degrading." "You stopped us to say that," Vixer called out, checking the edges of the alleyway for incoming troops. "The control. Baruger uses an advanced remote system to take control of his soldiers. Those aren't just prosthetics they're wearing. They're implants, but it's all based off a primary design." Alex was starting to understand. "Mikhail? But how? He was a Russian project." "I don't know, Alex, but that soldier under the fire escape looked at me before he died. His eyes shifted, the same way Mikhail's do," Shaylee explained. Alex's eyes went wide. "If Baruger has control of these augmented..." Alex! It was Janet's voice over the comm cutting him off. "You need to get to the reactor, now!" "Janet, what happened?" Alex yelled back. "Is it the reactor? Did Mikhail set it to blow?" Janet's voice went low. "No, Alex, it's Layla. She's dying." It was the success Thomas Baruger wanted. He never intended to destroy New Purgatory, not when there was the prospect of taking it back. A wounded Alexander Velasco in a broken team brought him one step closer to his goals. Why waste the land, labor, and resources when he could bleed the leadership and dominate the place once again? Baruger's plan was not war. It never had been. The destruction of the Crusaders was. Any man that had to watch his love die in his arms would never be fit to lead again. Dissension would grow, and when the time was right, Baruger would install his own leader in New Purgatory. It would be a fitting change to a land that had suffered to find freedom. For now, though, he would watch, wait, and enjoy the new toy he had under his command.
"Agent Koslov, I must compliment you on that impressive display of skill and trickery. I dare say that I could not have done better myself,"
Beruger said into his personal communication device. I should kill you for this. Make the pain stop. Make it all stop, Koslov replied. The sound of a hell-chopper engine was prevalent in the background.
Now, Mikhail, I negotiated the death of all the Crusader originals, and you quite nearly didn't murder this one. But don't worry. The pain will stop, and you'll have your memories back. For now, I'll take it all away for a time, but you will return to me. We have much to discuss about our future, and of course, your retirement.
Beruger waited for Mikhail to cut the comm, and then went back to looking at his monitors. The new Purgatory army had wiped out the last of his shell game forces, as he suspected they would. Thomas only wished he had a camera at the new Purgatory reactor, if only to take in Alexander Velasco's reaction. He wanted to see the look on his face when he finally figured out that the scientist had outplayed the soldier, if only so he could savor it. Alex didn't wait for a hell-chopper. He ran. He ran until his legs were worn to the bone and his lungs couldn't push any further. He kept running until he crossed the Brooklyn Bridge and was picked up by an old APC used by his soldiers. Alex had cut off his comm. He didn't want to hear any updates. When he was dropped in front of the reactor, he picked up his pace again and made for the heart of the facility. Alex, 20 meters from the reactor, Janet yelled out. It didn't take Alex long to find them. He ignored his team and dropped to Layla's side. She had somehow been able to stay conscious and alive, even though blood was seeping towards the entrance nearly a meter away. Alex, she said, looking towards him. He was in tears. Of all the people he could lose, Layla could not be one of them. Not because of the shadow he had called a friend. Not because she was his only love. I love you, she said as her head crashed against Alex's neck. He was holding her up now. Layla, no, please, no. Not like this. For the love of God, please, not like this. Alex cried as he spoke. He didn't care that his team was watching him in his weakest moment. He held Layla tight and reared back only to wait for her response. But when he looked in her eyes, Alex saw that she was gone. He screamed into the hallway, his voice echoing throughout the reactor. It was anger, sadness, and history bundled into a primal roar that he hoped his enemies could hear from every corner of the world. Then it turned into weeping. He cried into Layla's chest, hoping to hear just the faintest heartbeat. Janet felt tears roll down her eyes. Blondie was dead. Vale couldn't contain his anger. Ferris and Vixer were too far behind, but the other two wondered if they could hear Alex's screams as he gripped his dead lover. Alex finally looked down at Layla's wound and saw the device that had caused this. He reached and pulled it from Layla's flesh. Anger boiled up from under his skin. The icy feeling of anxiety in his chest was replaced by hatred, revenge, and psychopathy. The same survival knife that Mikhail Koslov had left behind before was now a message from his new master. Alex felt only murder in his heart. He wanted to kill anyone who stood in his way of finding Beruger and the Shadow and ending both men in a hail of bullets, a storm of bloodshed, or even his own fists. His hands were covered in blood now, and he couldn't scream anymore. It was all gone. He looked down at his blonde-haired angel and wept. Sentinels. They had guarded nothing and lost everything. It took a group of the new army soldiers to bring Alex back to Alonsfo's, while Janet and Ferris took care of Layla. They wrapped her in a body bag while they waited for Alex to calm down enough to decide what he wanted to do with her. It wouldn't come that night. Alex's team forced him to wash the blood that stained both his clothes and his body, and then left him in his room to cry and sleep. Alex did neither. In the middle of the night, he found himself looking for his journal. He searched through every cabinet and shelf until he saw it lying on the nightstand next to Layla's side of the bed. Old entries were pig-eared. She hadn't been reading on the road. She was going through the past, to a time before they had met. She was reading through his old memories. He turned each page one by one, looking at the entries she had saved. Did they mean anything to her? He kept flipping through pages until he ended up at his final entry. A small, well-drawn arrow pointed to the next page. He knew he hadn't done that. so he turned one last shred of paper over to the next page. There was Layla's handwriting that Alex read to himself.
I can't do this anymore. The death of our friends, the killing and the outright murder. It was all supposed to end when we killed John Morrison, but now it's escalated. Still, I find myself unable to give up on him. This is Alex's war. I have faith that he will end it, that he will break us away from the slaughter. He has to. I don't want to lose him, and I don't want him to lose me.
Alex felt his eyes become wet again. This was why she had been so angry, yet she opted to write it instead of telling him. The fighting had been getting the better of her, and he hadn't listened to her. He hadn't read what she wrote. If he had, maybe it would have all been different. He set the journal on her side of the bed and closed his eyes, hoping she would be there next to him in the morning. Alex wanted it all to be a bad dream. It was a lie. Layla never came. Layla Lansfield was dead.